Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being with us today. We're just going to give it one more minute for a few more folks to join us on screen, and then we'll get started. Okay. Liv, should we get started? Okay.
Right.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here for the second webinar in JCC Association's 8 Guiding Principles on Inclusion series. Our principle that we are focusing on today is the principle Shlemut, Wholeness. We're going to take a minute just to introduce ourselves, and then we'll get into our presentations. So, hi everyone, my name is Sierra Weiss. I am the Access and Inclusion Specialist for JCC Association. I use she, her pronouns, and I have white skin, curly brown hair, and I'm wearing a blue pattern blouse today. And I'm joining our call today from the JCC Association offices in Midtown, New York, which is the traditional land of the Munsee Lenape. And I'll pass it to my colleague, Liv, to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Liv Mendelson. I'm coming to you from Toronto, and I'm the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Consultant. Quite a few things there at the JCC Association. I also have pale white skin, short brown hair. I'm wearing a black and white polka dot dress. And the reason that Sierra and I are describing ourselves is that we want to create accessibility for people who are blind and low vision who may be joining us on this call. I'm coming to you from the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississauga of the Credit River. And I use she, her pronouns. We are also using some access features on the Zoom today. So there is live captioning. If you go to the bottom of your screen and click on the CC button, you'll be able to turn on and see the captions. And there will be a transcript saved so that you can have both the transcript and the video of this call to review in the future. So Sierra and I are really happy to be with you again today for our second webinar and conversation about the 8 principles around disability inclusion. And Sierra will take you through the agenda.
Yes, thank you, Liv. So we are now well on our way with welcomes and introductions. We are so excited to have 2 amazing speakers joining us this afternoon to give presentations. First, we'll have a presentation by Professor Rosemary Garland Thompson, and then a presentation by Rabbi Emily Aronson. And we'll have time at the end for Q&A with both of our presenters and Liv and I, if you have any questions for us as well. And then we'll wrap up and get us all prepared for next month's webinar as well. Liv, I'll pass it back to you.
Hey, so just a reminder, we know you have all 8 principles, and you know that the poster series is coming. We heard from Sharoni Sibney, our artist, last time. The principle we're looking at today is Shlemut, or wholeness. So people with disabilities are whole people who do not need to be cured or fixed. We view disability as a rich and essential part of human diversity. JCCs strive to be places where our whole selves are celebrated. So the presentations today will be speaking to that principle, and then Sierra and I will join all of you in conversation about how this applies to our work.
So to start us off today, we will have a presentation by Professor Rosemary Garland Thompson. Rosemary Garland Thompson is a disability justice and culture thought leader, bioethicist, teacher, and humanities scholar. Her 2016 editorial, Becoming Disabled, was the inaugural article in the ongoing weekly series in the New York Times about disability by people living with disabilities. She's a professor of English and bioethics at Emory University, where she teaches disability studies, bioethics, American literature and culture, and feminist theory. Her work develops the field of critical disability studies in the health humanities to bring forward disability access, inclusion, and identity to a broad range of institutions and communities. She's co-editor of About Us, essays from the New York Times about disability by people with disabilities, no longer forthcoming, this is it right here, and the author of Staring, How We Look, and several other books. Her current project is Embracing Our Humanity, a bioethics of disability and health. And I just need to add to this that I'm so fortunate to have had Rosemary as a professor and a mentor throughout my academic and professional career. And I am so honored to be sharing the screen again with her today. So Rosemary, I'll pass it on to you. Oh, you're still on mute.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here today for this really important work. And Sierra, thank you for the invitation. It's wonderful to be with you again and to learn about your work, and in particular to learn about the JCC's concept of accessibility, inclusion, and justice. So to begin, I'll describe myself as we have. I'm a pale-skinned, senior-ish woman with longer silver, what I call COVID hair now. And I am wearing some computer glasses, and I'm joining you today from my home office in San Francisco, California. So, in thinking about wholeness in relation to disability, I wanted to mention or to begin with the idea that disability, our story of what disability is that it is a violation of bodily form and function that encourages us to think about people with disabilities as partial people with partial minds, with damaged bodies, that we are people that do not have bodily or psychological or cognitive full capabilities. So this metaphor of partialness or woundedness stands in distinction to the idea of wholeness. And I wanted to begin with a line that I think is very important. This comes to us from the poet Lori Lambeth, and this is a corrective to that cultural narrative of people with disabilities as being partial or not being whole. And she writes in the New York Times in 2016 as part of the series on disability written by people with disabilities. She writes a personal essay called The Three-Legged Dog Who Carried Me. And it's about her relationship between herself as a person with what we'd call a mobility impairment, and her dog, who is a canine amputee, a three-legged rather than a four-legged dog. It's a very beautiful essay. And she ends this essay with a line that I find particularly important about disability, but also about human life or life in general. And she says, all creatures who persist are whole. And what she's trying to do is to counter this narrative of partialness, this narrative of damage this narrative of woundedness that goes along with disability, and to redefine wholeness, not in terms of bodily or body-mind shape or form, but rather in temporal terms. In other words, she redefines what we think of as wholeness from what we think of as spatial. In other words, having all your limbs, or the dog having all of its legs. She redefines this by saying that wholeness is not a matter of shape, but it's a matter of time. It's a matter of persistence over time. And that to continue to exist is what defines wholeness, rather than the shape of what we are. And I think it's a very powerful redefinition of what we think of as wholeness, moving wholeness from space to time. Okay, next slide. And I wanted to give us some examples to share today that come from an artist named Riva Lehrer, and I'm showing you a picture here of Riva Lehrer. This is a photograph of Riva Lehrer, the artist, in her studio, or in a studio, next to a portrait that she has done, a self-portrait. Riva is a middle-aged woman with, in this picture, short, spiky, really great red and white hair. She's wearing a white t-shirt, and she's leaning against a desk. In the background is a portrait that she has done, in which she shows her back. It's a very beautiful portrait. If you go to Riva Lehrer, Lehrer, R-I-V-A, Lehrer, you go to her website, you can see all of her work, all of her portraits. She does portraits of people with disabilities, not only herself, but other people with disabilities. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. She's showing here her own body. She was born with spina bifida, and this portrait, in which she is sitting in a pool of water with her back facing to us, shows the open spine that she was born with, which of course is not open now. And it's a portrait of Riva's essential wholeness, even though that she is imagined as being a person with a damaged body, a body that is not whole. Riva's portrait shows her as being whole. Next slide. I'm showing you a few other portraits. This is a self-portrait of Riva. It has two parts, the part that shows her head and the part that shows her feet. She wears very unusual shoes that look a lot like Doc Martens, but they're in fact orthopedic shoes that are shoes that make walking more effective for Riva. She has an unusual gait. And so her self-portrait here shows the wholeness of her body by showing the top of it and the bottom of it, and not showing the middle of it, the part of her body that is imagined in the world as being the disabled, the wounded, the partial, the not whole part of her body. So her head and her feet create here in this self-portrait a picture of Riva's essential fundamental wholeness. Next slide.
I'll just mention briefly, if it's okay, it says across her forehead in Hebrew letters, emet, which in Hebrew translates to truth, which I think is just something beautiful to note in the context of this conversation.
Thank you. You know, of all the times I've looked at this, Sierra, I have missed those Hebrew letters, thinking they were simply part of Riva's bangs. And that, of course, is the aesthetic effect here. So your careful reading, which is made possible by the fact that you read Hebrew, has helped us interpret this portrait in ways that I didn't know about before. Thank you. Here is an image of Riva's new book called Golem Girl that came out in 2020, and it's a memoir. And in this portrait, in this book are many of the pictures, the portraits that Riva has painted, not only of herself, but of other leaders of the disability community and other people with disabilities that Riva has chosen to paint. So it's a particularly wonderful book because it's composed of images and text. So it's a story that has illustrations that are imagistic as well as narratives that are composed of text. So it's really quite a wonderful book, and I very much recommend it. Next slide. I wanted to show you some images of other artists, people with disabilities, for just a few moments to talk about two dancers who are dancers who have redefined the movement vocabulary of contemporary dance by creating an entire set of movements for dancers that are, in one case, a dancer who is a one-legged dancer, Homer Avila, and I'm showing here an image of Homer with his one leg extended to the floor, his body resting on a chair, and one of his arms raised. So, and his other missing leg is highlighted here by his posture in this photograph. So Homer is a one-legged dancer. He has died now, so you can get and look at some of his dance vocabulary. And by becoming a one-legged dancer after his leg was amputated, he had the opportunity to completely redefine what it means to dance, since it has been the assumption that legs, two legs, dancing on legs is the essential property of the dance form, of dance in general, but certainly contemporary dance. So Homer got to redefine the dance vocabulary in very meaningful and important ways, to redefine, to illustrate again, to counter the idea that wholeness for a dancer relies on dancing on two legs, that dancing on one leg is a new form of wholeness. I'm showing on the left an image of David Toole, who recently died as well. He is a English, I think British, actually English dancer, and he is a legless dancer. He is dancing here on one of his arms. He again has redefined the vocabulary of contemporary dance by showing the possibilities of a movement vocabulary that relies on arms and on floor work, much like Homer Avila's dance vocabulary, to redefine what it means to dance and to be a legless dancer. And it's particularly beautiful here to note, I think, the costuming here, that these dancers, the one-legged dancer and the legless dancer, offered as a new way to create the aesthetic costuming of dance, as a sense of aesthetic wholeness. Here, David Toole has a skirt, which works particularly effectively, of course, and counters some of our gender expectations around dancers. And this is a skirt designed by Alexander McQueen, the English, late English fashion designer. Next slide. Again, in terms of redefining our concept of wholeness, I wanted to introduce you to the MIT engineer, Hugh Hare, whose legs were amputated as a result of a climbing accident when he was a teenager. And he has participated in what we might want to call disability gain, because his disability, his double amputation, for him was an opportunity to explore the development of prosthetics that could be used for mountain climbing, which was his his interest and his life activity, like Homer Avila and David Toole were dancers, Hugh Hare is a legless mountain climber who has developed these really important prosthetic legs that allow him and other climbers or other people to live in the world effectively using the prosthetic legs that Hugh Hare and other people that work on the development of these prosthetic technologies at MIT have developed to increase the quality of life for people with disabilities by making it possible for them to flourish as people with disabilities using the built environment in ways that all human beings do to achieve a high quality of life. So like people who use ramps every day to carry out a high quality of life, Hugh Hare and other people that use the prosthetics that he has designed are able to flourish because they have access to a built environment, here prosthetic legs, and also the kinds of devices that we all use, ramps, for example, or any other kind of designed and built prosthetic implements, such as the houses we live in, the mouses that we use, all of the prosthetic devices that we use to extend our bodies into the world. Next slide. I wanted to continue the idea of wholeness as an extension of the body into the world, whether that extension is in the form of a cane, whether it's in the form of a prosthetic device, whether it's in the form of a pen as a prosthetic device for those of us who write, a computer as a prosthetic device. In other words, a designed and built implement that extends the human body into the world, a tool, if you will, by showing us, of course, an image. This is from 2012 of our Congresswoman, now Senator Tammy Duckworth, who is a biracial woman who is an Iraq War veteran, who is a double amputee, who was a US Congresswoman and now is a US Senator. And this is my favorite part of Tammy Duckworth. Sometimes she uses a wheelchair, sometimes she uses the prosthetic legs that are in this image of her addressing the Democratic National Convention. She's shown here from the back, so you can, her prosthetic legs and her cane shows, as well as her really fashionable red blazer, and she's addressing an audience from the podium. She was also recently the first woman wheelchair user, but also the first woman to breastfeed in the US Senate. And I'm here to tell you that Mitch McConnell didn't like that very much, but nonetheless, she did it anyway. So Tammy Duckworth, I think, is really an important figure to instruct us that all creatures who persist are whole. So she became a double amputee by being shot down in her helicopter in a battle, and that she managed to persist. And her story is that she was dragged out of that helicopter by a colleague, and that she lived. And this persistence is what makes her whole. This temporal persistence, this insistence on being present in the world, that creates the sense of wholeness for someone like Reva Lehrer, someone like Hugh Hare, someone like Tammy Duckworth. We may have another slide here. I think this is the final slide. How am I doing for time, Sierra?
Good, we have about 4 more minutes.
Perfect. I talk a lot. So I wanted to offer another set of images about wholeness that come from a really important, long-standing campaign, if you will, or now tradition of embodiment that began in the 1970s with what we call the breast cancer movement. And the breast cancer movement was started by women who were having mastectomies due to breast cancer. In other words, they were experiencing the surgical amputation of their breasts to save their lives. And they were realizing that there was a politics of this because femininity and their status as a woman was extremely informed by their breastedness, because breasts, of course, are a very significant sexual and cultural icon that defines femininity and defines womanhood. And so these women were engaging in a longstanding campaign to show the truth of their embodiments if they had had their breasts, one or both of their breasts, amputated. And so they began, starting again in the 1970s and through the 1990s, these are more recent photographs, a campaign of showing images of themselves, showing their mastectomy scars, showing their breastedness, their Amazonian breastedness. And this tradition has continued so that you can go online now and see these self-portraits, these portraits of women showing with pride the new forms of embodiment, their new wholeness that they're showing. And these just are a few examples from the Stand Up to Cancer campaign. These are photographed by Amy Barwell of 3 women displaying their breasts, displaying their chests. We have on the left a Black woman or a woman of African descent who is showing her mastectomy scars. They don't appear to be tattooed. This is a tradition now that has developed of women having these scars tattooed, often with flowers or plants to present themselves as aesthetically whole. And then on the top, we have another woman who appears to be a white woman who is displaying her mastectomy scars. And then on the bottom right, we have an image of another woman who has one breast amputated. This is a very symmetrical self-portrait, if you will, or photographic portrait, where we have the very unusual form of embodiment, an assertion of her essential wholeness, this one-breasted woman in this really quite beautiful pose. So there's a whole genre of self-representation that you can find of these one-breasted or breastless whole women. And I want to offer that as a new definition of the persistence across time that Lori Lambeth offers us as a new way to imagine wholeness. Wholeness as persistence over time, rather than wholeness as any sense of normative bodily integrity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosemary, for this presentation. It is always such a pleasure and a privilege to learn from you. So thank you for joining us. And we'll have some time at the end for Q&A with Rosemary and Emily together. So if you have questions and you're concerned you might forget, please jot them down or feel free to put them now in the chat, and we will take a look at those after we wrap up the next presentation. So now, Liv, if I could have you switch the pins, thank you. It is my honor to welcome Rabbi Emily Aronson to the screen with us today. Emily was ordained from HUC JIR in 2021. She recently launched Chronic Congregation, a project focused on the intersection of Judaism, disability, and chronic illness. She currently serves as the interim dean of students at HUC New York, as well as the reform rabbi at the Bronfman Center for Jewish Student Life at NYU. During rabbinical school, Rabbi Aronson served as the rabbinic intern in synagogues, pastoral care settings, and Israel organizations. Rabbi Aronson attended List College at the Jewish Theological Seminary and Columbia University, earning a BA in Jewish thought and a BA in ethnicity and race studies. Emily, I welcome you now to take the screen.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here today. And Rosemary, it's an honor to be here with you, as I've read a lot of your work in my research, so this is very exciting for me. So my name is Rabbi Emily Aronson. I'm a white woman with short, like chin-length curly hair, and I'm wearing dark red glasses. I'm wearing a sweater over a dark red shirt. And I am at my office at HUC in Lower Manhattan, the land of the Lenape people. So the slides that I'm using today have a color scheme of blush pink, white, and then I use accent colors of red, orange, and like a light blue. And so those are the colors that will come up on each slide. So we'll go to the first slide here. So I'd like to start with my story, because a lot of my work is very personal, and I've come to this work because of my experience. So I wanted to start with that. I was in college when I very suddenly became ill, and I went through a 2-year process of receiving a diagnosis, which was a challenging thing to navigate as a young person in a place that wasn't home to me. And a lot of what I was navigating was having an invisible illness, that when you look at me, there's no way to know that there's anything happening beneath the surface, that I'm navigating these challenges. And I had a lot of really challenging experiences in Jewish spaces of being a young person who presented as somebody who was healthy, being expected to stand for prayers, being expected to give up my seat when actually I needed to be seated, being expected to be able to carry things and do things that other people my age are expected to be able to do in their bodies. And it led me to kind of take on a lot of shame and guilt about what I was going through. There was a lot of shame about my body. And so I kept it all hidden. It wasn't until I started rabbinical school that I realized that sharing my story was actually a powerful tool for being able to connect with other people. So once I started sharing my story, I met other people like me, other people who were understanding what I was going through. And so that has really propelled me further into this work of needing to kind of own my own story, my own narrative, and the relationship to my body in order to continue doing this work. So it led me to write my rabbinic thesis, titled From Curing to Crying, Determining God's Role in Healing for Those with Chronic Illness. And through this work, I realized that I was carrying a lot of internalized ableism, that all of the ideas about disability in society, I was applying to myself. And so I was actually very afraid to identify as disabled because I was worried about the stigma that carried. And so it took a long time for me to understand, really through study, that chronic illness was the mechanism through which I was disabled. And so coming to that realization propelled me further into this work to launch this new project called Chronic Congregation, to really be able to bring these worlds together that I had experienced as very disparate elements of my life. So let's go to the next slide. So a lot of what I spend time thinking about is the theological implications of cure and healing. In Jewish liturgy and prayers, there's a lot of emphasis on prayers for healing, and there are a lot of texts that speak about God as healer. And I had a lot of trouble with this. And so I wanted to parse out the difference between healing and cure. So with cure, and a lot of my research in this has come from works by Eli Clare, Susan Wendell, and Nancy Iceland, to name where my sources are coming from. And what I have discovered is that cure is about the recovery from or eradication of a disease or illness. Cure is identifying that there is a problem in the body that needs to be fixed. I'm going to contrast that to healing, which can be related to the idea of returning to health, but it also has a bigger picture approach of being identified with the holistic process of finding meaning while experiencing illness or on this journey of becoming whole. So healing can also be related to things other than illness. A lot of times we talk about a healing journey during grief and mourning. So there's healing is just kind of a bigger picture term. And so I started to dig into why cure was so problematic to me. What was wrong with this idea of cure, and why did it sit really poorly with me? And so the kind of one of the underlying assumptions of cure is that it relies on the dichotomies of healthy and unhealthy, perfect and imperfect, broken and whole. It really creates these binary ideals of what is good and what is bad. And that in order to have worth, somebody whose body was different needed to be fixed. Let's go to the next slide. So then I really started to dig into Jewish text. So in Hebrew, Hebrew is a very concise language. There is one word that means both healing and cure, and that word is rofeh. In transliteration, that is spelled R-O-F-E-I. In Hebrew, this is spelled Resh Vav Pei Aleph. And in the Bible, specifically in the Torah, God is responsible both for causing illness and for restoring health. In all the cases in which God acts to change someone from sick to healthy, God is called Rofeh. It's usually translated as healer. I would argue that sometimes God is acting as a curer, and this is where some of our theological challenges start to develop. Next slide, please. So I want to give an example of how this theology plays out in a text. So this is I'm going to name ahead of time, this is a very challenging text theologically, and then I'm going to unpack what those challenges are and how we can move forward from these really challenging theological texts within Jewish tradition. This text is from Bereshit Rabbah, Vayigash, chapter 95, 1. This is a rabbinic commentary. And this is one example. This is not meant to be the end-all be-all of any representation of Jewish text. I will also note that I use, I left the most kind of harsh translation as is. So the text reads, "Come and see how all whom the Holy One, blessed be God, has smitten in this world, God will cure in the future that is to come." That word cure is usually read as heal. I made the decision to translate it as cure. "The blind will be cured," as it says, "then the eyes of the blind shall be opened," from Isaiah. "The lame shall be cured, then the lame man leap as a hart," from Isaiah. "The mute shall be cured, and the tongue of the mute shall sing," from Isaiah. "And just as a person goes out from this world, so shall he enter into the next. If he goes out blind, he will come back blind. If he goes out deaf, he will return deaf. If he goes out mute, he will return mute. If he goes out lame, he will return lame." Why does a person return as he went? So that people should not say, after they died, God cured them and then brought them back. Apparently, these are not the same people who died, but others. The Holy One, blessed be God, said, "If so, let them rise as they went to the grave, and after the resurrection I will cure them." Why so? That you may know that before me there was no God formed, neither shall any be after me. It's a quote from Isaiah. "And I shall cure them." So to summarize this text, God has caused disability in this world, and there's a promise that God will cure people with disability in the future to come. If somebody has a disability when they die, when they are resurrected, we're just going with that theology. That's a whole different conversation. In the world to come, they will also awake with their disability. And why is that? It's so that then God will cure them, so that God is recognized as this all-powerful being with that power. So let's go to the next slide and we'll kind of unpack why this is a problematic text. So first of all, the text rests on the assumption that disabilities are something bad that need to be fixed or cured. It devalues the worth of somebody with a disability by saying that their disability should be removed, should be taken away, should be fixed in order for them to live a fulfilling life in the world to come. The text also states that God caused the disabilities in the first place. So this raises a whole host of issues. If the disabilities are considered bad, wrong, then why would God cause them in the first place? Why wouldn't God cure them while they were alive if they are considered bad? So what this thinking does is it promotes the idea of disability as a punishment. It promotes the idea that if you sin, God will cause disability as something bad happening to you. And it also promotes the idea of virtuous suffering, because if God has the power to cure and does not cure, the assumption is that that person is still doing something sinful, that they have not earned their way out of disability. And so it promotes these ideas of disability as punishment and virtuous suffering. Finally, God acts the way that God does to get the credit for this transformative power. God is not concerned with what the people want for their bodies. God is deciding what should happen to somebody else's body based on God's own perception of what bodies have worth. And so this text is one example of the ways in which cure is set up within Jewish tradition in many places that really disregards personal autonomy, personal worth, and it negates the idea that I know was the focus of last session of being created b'tselem Elohim, being created in the image of God. And so we're gonna now take a look, let's go to the next slide, of ways that we can reconstruct different ideas of God that mirror the idea that we are made in the image of God, and that reject these harmful notions of cure, whether divine or human. So one of the main pieces of work that I've read that really inspired this was a book by Nancy Iceland called The Disabled God Toward a Liberatory Theology of Disability. I have the book over here. And what she does is she reclaims Jesus's crucified body as a disabled body, thereby enabling disabled people to see themselves firmly represented within Christian tradition and a meaningful, empowering light. She writes, "Our bodies participate in the Imago Dei, not in spite of our impairments and contingencies, but through them." So through this process of refuting harmful theological and societal claims, Iceland makes the statement that disability, quote, becomes a new model of wholeness and a symbol of solidarity. In so doing, she rejects cure as a divine goal and instead focuses on the inherent holiness of each body as it is. Now let's go to the next slide. So this laid a really strong foundation for me, and I wanted to be able to find images within Jewish tradition that would also mirror the sentiment that she raises with Jesus's body. And so I started to go through different theological concepts, different metaphors for God that would work for me as somebody with chronic illness and disability, and that I hoped would be something that would mirror the emphasis on wholeness that Nancy Iceland has promoted. And the image that came to me as something that is a strong metaphor rests on the ideas of pastoral care. So pastoral care, quote, rests on the assumption that being in caring connection can transform suffering because relationship shatters isolation and provides an opportunity for reflecting on one's experience. This is from Dale Friedman. And so for me, the God as a pastoral presence is by our side, shares in our experiences of pain, of suffering, of ableism, and thereby breaks through barriers of isolation and loneliness that can be very common for people with disability and chronic illness because of the way that they're received by society. So this removes the idea of cure or perfection, and it offers a different type of support and relationship from God that's through empathy and shared experience. And for me, what's important here is that this is a mutual relationship. For me, it's something that I depend on, like I am in relationship with God and God is in relationship with me in this pastoral setting. So let's go to the next slide. So some of the questions that I'll leave you with is, what are the ways in which our theology affects the way that we speak about and to disabled people? This has really been a matter of my own internal processing of kind of coming to these ideas. And so I'll ask you as well to think about the ways in which your theology informs the way that you think about disability. Second, how can theological and liturgical innovation serve as a model for creative approaches to accessibility in all of its forms? How do we give ourselves permission to think creatively and expansively about what accessibility can look like that's not just about the physical space, but also about the spiritual, the emotional avenues that people navigate? And finally, when we reject cure as a goal, divine or human, what are we making room for? What are we giving ourselves permission to explore? How are we making room for people with disabilities? And what else are we going to discover about each other when we do this work? Thank you.
Emily, thank you so much for that presentation. And thank you both for sharing your insights and providing these two really interesting and different perspectives on wholeness. We want to open the floor now to the audience here. If you have any questions that you would like to ask our presenters or Liv and I, we welcome you to either unmute and ask or put in the chat and we can read out the questions you have. Or additionally, as we're thinking about this principle of Shlemut, wholeness, and I have the wrong translation in here, so please ignore that. But as you're thinking about this principle that we spent the last almost an hour discussing, if you have ideas of how you can incorporate it into your work at your JCC, we welcome you to share that with us in the chat as well.
I have one, Sierra. This is Aaron Kaufman speaking.
Please, Aaron, go ahead.
Emily, it's great to see another Temple Micah member on the screen, and that was just wonderful. What I wanted to ask you in particular is, do you think that JCCs and other Jewish institutions do a good job of espousing the values that you articulated through Miss Iceland? And if not, what recommendations would you give to all the JCC's professionals that are on the call today to move towards that?
Thanks, Aaron. It's nice to see you here and have another Temple Micah member nearby over Zoom. I think that I would say most Jewish spaces, most Jewish organizations are starting to do this work really thoughtfully. I think that disability has kind of long been on the back burner in terms of work around people with marginalized identities. I think disability is really just coming to the fore largely because of COVID and the ways that we think about access to materials. So I think that this is actually, I think, a fantastic example of the ways that that organizations can go about this work, because what this series is doing, from what I understand, is it's not just saying like, here are the steps that we're going to go through, but here's why this is of value. I think it's really starting from this place of finding value in each other and bringing people together in conversation around values before moving to like, here are the logistics of what we're going to do to make sure that our text, that we have, you know, large print text available, that we have audio, that we have transcriptions. So I think this could really be a model to me of the ways in which other Jewish organizations and communities go about this kind of work, because until we see the inherent worth in each other, we're not going to want to have everyone as part of our communities.
Thank you. And tell Lindsay I say hello.
I will.
You can raise your hands or put your questions in the chat. Gary, I noticed that you just wrote something in the chat. Do you want to unmute and just speak to that point? If not, I'm happy
I'm
to.
sorry. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Go for it.
I'm outside, so it's like hard for me to connect with it. I think that both presentations were excellent. I think the challenges that we as JCC professionals have is really positioning ourselves as the educator and as the human being, if you will, you know, to see someone with perhaps maybe their external challenges, but yet going beyond that, they're looking into the eyes of that person, going to the neshama. If we believe that, and I do, that we're all created in the image of God, I'm not so sure I know what God looks like yet. I hope not to meet God for another 120 years from now, but I have an inkling and I have an understanding through the value system that has been transmitted to me in education through family and or texts and so on. So I think what we could do as JCC professionals is trying to come up with a real focus on seeing everyone that walks through our doors as a human being that is created in the image of God. And more importantly, that you go beyond that. You look at the soul of the person. So I'm like, I appreciate the presentations, and I'd like to hear what everybody else has to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. And I'll just say, I know we've heard a lot from folks on the autism spectrum and in that population that they have experienced a lot of efforts towards cure rather than focus on meeting them as they are, welcoming them into our communities as full participating, contributing members as they are. So I'm just channeling a voice from that community who I know many of us are offering programs and supports to. I see another hand. Sharoni, do you want to unmute?
Sure. Hi, thank you so much for this. This has been a beautiful and so substantial workshop webinar today. Thank you. I think I'm kind of reflecting on what Rabbi Aronson was talking about, and I don't know, this is not a fully formulated thought, but I keep going back to a moment in the book of Genesis when some strangers who turn out to be angels or messengers of God show up at Abraham's tent door. Abraham is the founder of the Jewish faith, according to the Torah. And in that moment, he himself has been in a position of well, he has just performed his own circumcision a chapter earlier. So he's in a state of healing himself in bodily terms, right? And he's supposedly in a kind of weaker state, but he jumps up and he greets them and he offers them a little water to bathe their feet. And then he has his wife make them some bread. And I think about that image because we are often taught in the Jewish tradition that one of the key tenets of Judaism and of maybe another way to think about what it means to be made in the image of God is to think about like the hospitality and the way that you support other people who show up at your door. And so as JCC staffers, maybe this is something we can think about. And because of what Rabbi Aronson has been talking about, and I heard her do this a version of this talk recently elsewhere. Sorry, I was thinking how it related in my mind to a beautiful passage from a book by Parker Palmer. Parker Palmer is, I don't know, he just writes a lot of sort of self-help things, I think, in addition to other things, but he talked about a period of deep depression that he struggled through, and he was basically silenced in this depression. He couldn't speak anymore. And he said, a friend of his, and I'm just going to read you the two sentences, Bill, stopped by my home every afternoon, sat me down in a chair, knelt in front of me, removed my shoes and socks, and for half an hour simply massaged my feet. He found the one place in my body where I could still experience feeling and feel somewhat reconnected with the human race. And in my mind, that image of the God as comforter, as crying person, as crying figure beside you that Rabbi Aronson talks about kind of maps onto this image of Abraham taking care of the feet of the person who comes to his door. And so thinking about what it means to open our doors so wide and to like think about the divinity and the dignity of every person we're meeting through that image of like from the root up, in a sense. I don't know, I just wanted to throw that into the conversation in case it triggered some extra interesting thoughts for people, but I think there's something really powerful about that. It's not practical, but it's a really nice motif.
Beautiful, beautiful. In the last couple minutes, as we always try to do at the end, and this conversation will of course keep going, I'm wondering if there's anyone who's thinking about how this applies practically in their work, in their JCC. It's okay if you're still processing and thinking, but if there is anyone who has a thought around that, by all means, unmute and go for it.
And I see Rosemary, go ahead while everyone ponders that.
Thank you. I really wanted to ask about this. When I was studying bioethics, as Sierra did, I took a class in religious bioethics, and we read a book by Elliot Dorff about Jewish bioethics. And in that, Elliot Dorff mentioned a prayer that I wanted to ask you about, Emily, well, all of us, but Emily in particular, and I'm going to get this a little wrong, but it's a prayer that Jews are, I don't know where it comes from, are supposed to say when they see a person with a disability. And that prayer is something like, thank God for human diversity, but that's not the term that's used, that there are such wondrous creatures in the world, kind of a comment. And it stands in contradistinction to other kinds of prayers that would say, thank God I'm not like that. And I thought that was an extraordinarily moving and important kind of response that comes in Jewish tradition to a framing of disability as diversity, this wondrous diversity created by God, rather than the other traditions that we have in the Abrahamic tradition, and that is disability as a punishment for previous sins, or disability as that which is to be cured. Could you talk just a little bit about this? Do you know this prayer? I have it a little wrong.
Yeah, I think you definitely got to the essence of the prayer. I don't know where it comes from, but it is a blessing for, like, it is something like varied creatures on this earth. It does use that kind of language. It looks like Sharoni has linked an article to it, so I can pull it up.
Wonderful.
Really quickly. Blessing. Okay, so it's called a blessing. Oh, blessing on seeing an unusual creature. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who makes creatures different. That's a close translation. There is to me, what this does is it gives agency to each of us to write our own blessings. Blessings over time are developed and changed to adapt to the ways that we live today. I think this is a beautiful example of something that surely came a little later in tradition, and it is a way of kind of affirming the divinity in each of us, that each of us are imprints of God on this earth, or that we have like the soul of a godliness within us. And so it is kind of, it does stand in distinction to all these other ideas, which I think is a wonderful thing, that we can hold, like, there's this beautiful blessing over here, and there's these really challenging texts over here, and how do we put those in conversation?
Thank you. And writing our own blessings is part of our tradition and part of the work, the communal work that happens in Jewish life in JCCs. I'm going to call on Limor Cohen, who has some thoughts just on practical application of some of the things that we've been thinking about. And then I know we're about a minute over time, so we will wrap up. But thank you, Limor, for sharing with us from your role at a JCC.
Hi there. The presentations were just excellent. Left me sort of with a lot of questions. In my role, I am noticing that a lot of folks are feeling, I mean, we're still sort of in this COVID situation, so that in itself is just a different, is challenge in and of itself. But I guess what I want to raise and what I'm just left with is the internalized ableism and the stigma that individuals with hidden or acquired disability are carrying with them, and how to connect with people when we know that this sort of the stigma is still there. How do we make those connections with people that we see are struggling, who are marginalized or oppressed, and and letting them know that we're all doing a little piece to carve out more safe spaces. It's just, yeah.
That is our ongoing work. I'm gonna let Sierra thank our amazing presenters. I'm first gonna thank all of you who again have joined us for the second session. We do promise that there will be some opportunities for you guys to meet each other and to form a learning cohort. We are heading towards that. I know several of you have asked to connect with your peers, and that is coming. And thank you for spending some more time with us as Rabbi Aronson said, really mapping out these values that are at the root of the work that we're going to be doing together. And I'm going to turn it to Sierra to thank our exceptional presenters.
Thank you, Liv, and thank you all for being here and participating with us today. Special thanks to Professor Rosemary Garland Thompson and Rabbi Emily Aronson for their beautiful presentations. Please be on the lookout for a follow-up email that will include a recording that you can send of this presentation to those who you work with or who you know who were unable to join but would be interested in learning more, as well as the slide deck from the presentation and details for the upcoming webinars. The next webinar in this series will be on April 12th. We will have a representative from Access Israel joining us, as well as other exciting speakers. So stay tuned for the next conversation, which will be on the principle of accessibility. So thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.